Welcome to Bloomington Rotary Club's weekly celebration of service, August 13th. Thanks to today's greeter, Dick McKay, our photographer, Charlie Osborne, the Cats from Cats, and roundabout reporter, Katie Beck. Our pledge and reflection will be from Judy Schroeder.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Please be seated. Hi there. Today, I want to reflect on our club newsletter over the 30-plus years I've been a member. Bob Salzberg and I were inducted in the same meeting in 1988, and we've been on that committee ever since. In fact, I'd like all of you who have been or are being a Rotary reporter to stand up, because I'm really reporting for you. And so let's give you all a hand. I can remember typing, and I do mean on a typewriter, the newsletter, and taking it by Wednesday evening for sure down to the north side of the square where Tim Riggins would copy it, put a label on it and a stamp, and put it in the U.S. Postage so that we would have it in our mailbox by Saturday at the latest. Then we got email, and that made things better, although Natalie still sends out a few to members who don't have email. Things plugged along with faithful reporters re-upping every year until Jim Bright became president-elect in 2011. Now, Jim has a way of shaking things up. And he met with our committee and he said, you know, what about a new design with photos? Oh my gosh. Enter Charlie Osborne, who's been popping up ever since at every meeting to take pictures of our speaker and our club activities. You know, Rotary has a history of bad puns. Before women were allowed in Rotary, the wives of Rotarians were known as Rotarians. The newsletter was in that tradition. It was called the Rota Letter. So Jim said, what about a new name? Well, I lay awake nights thinking, what says Bloomington, Rotary, newsletter, and came up with Roundabout, and the committee endorsed it, and that's our name. So, but then this spring we started wondering, is anybody reading it? So we came up with the idea of a survey, the committee, and thanks to Sarah Laughlin's expertise in writing surveys and putting them into SurveyMonkey, we asked you to let us know how we were doing. You know what? You made us feel good. Nearly 60% of you, and that's a phenomenal return for a survey, answered, and more than 7 out of 10 said you read it almost always, and only one person said almost never. Is it the truth? I respect that person. More than 40% of you have forwarded it to someone, a guest potential, and more than 85% of you have clicked on a link to sign up for something. In fact, the Roundabout remains our club's main communication link. Only about a third of you keep up with Rotary on social media, and a quarter of you say you check the website. A resounding 95% of you say you're very satisfied with the Roundabout. What do you value most? Not surprisingly, it's news of the next meeting. What are we going to do? Although you read what we have done at our weekly celebrations. And I just, on behalf of the newsletter committee, want to thank you for your response and assure you that we will keep trying to serve you, because communication is key to community. In one area, however, I'm afraid we're going to have to let you down. We can't oblige the member who asked that we include the winning numbers for the next lottery. Sorry about that.
How about some applause for our roundabout chair and leader? Now, Steve Moberly will introduce our guests. You've earned it.
Good afternoon, Rotarians and guests. We have several guests today, 7 to be exact. When I call your name, would you please stand so we can give you a Rotary welcome? Alan Bergen, the guest of Ann Connor. Heather Bozarth, the guest of Jean Emery. Mike Riggle, the guest of Ron Barnes. Vaughn Welch, the guest of Scott Shackelford. Sarah Cochran, the guest of Trent Deckard. And Liz Brownlee, who's the guest of the Sycamore Land Trust. We welcome you all, and if you would like more information about Rotary, please talk to your host or anyone else at your table, and we hope you'll see you back soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. And I want to mention that probably half of our guests or more have a background in Rotary, either another club or growing up. So thank you for being here. This week's birthdays: Lauren Snyder, August 9th, and Kenneth Sparks, August 11th. And club anniversaries, and I'm going over and repeating what we had would have said at Wonder Lab, but anniversaries: Kate Cruikshank, 4th, Bill Oates, the first this time around, but Bill, how many total?
I joined in '92.
Okay, 10, yeah. Okay, and Liz Irwin with her 6th anniversary, Glenn Steenberger, his 8th, Steve Engel, 8th, Megan Neese, already 3rd, Judy DeMuth, 18th, and Jean Emery, 17th. And also congratulations to Glenn Steenberger, who celebrated 25 years as executive with the Boy Scouts of America. And now Mike Baker, former president and foundation chair, will have a presentation. Charlie?
Well, Charlie will be here in a minute. Good afternoon. Most of you know Rotary recognizes an individual as a Paul Harris Fellow for their support of the Rotary Foundation and for community service, club activities, and all of that together. We Rotarians often designate a Paul Harris Fellow as a tribute to a person whose life demonstrates a shared purpose with the objectives of the Rotary Foundation. I always enjoy doing this, but today's sort of special. I'd like to have a good friend of mine, someone I've known a long time, come up. I'm excited and proud to honor one of our own, Fred Dunn. Fred, please come up here. little off script now. In 1976, Fred and his brother George took a chance on hiring an ex-Marine Corps veteran, and we weren't in big demand back then. So they hired me, and I think I was the first college graduate that Seward and Company hired. Seward and Company. Think of the courthouse fish. One of Fred's relatives made that. Sewards and Dunns, two of the oldest names in Bloomington. Started the business in 1821. That was my first shot of getting in business. So I'm excited today to present Fred Dunn as a Paul Harris Fellow. His service to our club for over 40 years has been quiet, behind the scenes most of the time. All of our club secretaries will say, yes, Fred was always there helping us, putting stuff up at the table, picking up after the meetings. If we had to name a table after Rotarian, it would probably be Fred, and he and Craig Spence would be at the very back, middle of the room, every meeting. Isn't that right, Craig? So Fred, please accept our congratulations and sincere thanks for your commitment to our club and to Rotary. So I'm going to give you this. And I've been waiting to pin you for a while. Here, give me some cheese. Rotarians, give it up for Fred Dunn. Hey, Fred.
Thank you. Wow, thank you, Mike, our centennial president. Pre-program announcements. Please read the roundabout for more information on things that I'm going to do a short, abbreviated job on. First, I have big thanks to Wonder Lab, especially our Rotary member and Wonder Lab officer, Amy Osajima. And we have a Wonder Lab member here. So let's give thanks to Wonder Lab. For our recent meeting, and Glenda Murray for organizing the amazing, friendly, family-friendly, all Bloomington Rotary Science and Health Exploration event with our district governor's visit at Wonder Lab. Glenda. We had a total of 120, around 120 people attending, 39 of whom were kids. And it was a real blast. Who was there? Yeah, it just was a great event. We're hoping to do it in the future. I want to thank the presidents of the other two Bloomington Rotary Clubs, Brian Hain at North and Cheyenne Riker at Sunrise, and Jim Bright and Sarah Laughlin and District Governor Santana Naidu and District Governor-elect Jessica Hain. And of course, our photographers and social media team. Thank you all. Next, there's a flyer on the tables, it's 8 by 10, about Bedford Rotary's Centennial, August 25th. It's free from 2 to 5 p.m. in the restored downtown Railroad Depot. If you want more information, I'll bring some, or I can email anyone who wants to request. It's going to be based on fun. They didn't have a big budget to spend, and it's really neat, active, hands-on, and so check it out. Their club was founded by this club, by 30 members of this club going down to Bedford, and we hope we could have maybe 30 of us come down to help them celebrate on Sunday the 25th. 2 to 5 p.m. Okay, I have a running announcement that I haven't been making on the Rotary Leadership Institute. Please check the roundabout for that. Rotary Directory, if you don't have one yet, please talk to Natalie. Reminder that next week we meet here at St. Mark's again. We have a board meeting on Thursday, August 15th. And then the Teachers Warehouse Community Service Project for August was a big success. We don't know exactly how big a success it is. Next week, Sarah will fill us in on that. The club's Hyper Happy Dollars alone netted $545. So please, everyone who volunteered in some way for Teachers Warehouse and the food drive, please stand up and let us acknowledge you. Thank you. Then Bloomington Rotary's next 505 gathering, August 15th. It's coming up too, this Thursday. Location is at Nick's upstairs. Members and prospective members from all 3 Bloomington Rotary clubs are invited. Come for a few minutes or a couple of hours for fellowship, a drink, iced tea, snack, or dinner. These are fun. I think we'll start a conversation about what we're going to do for the holiday party. So if you have any ideas about that, come to Nick's 505 on Thursday. Other announcement, the Community Services Committee is going to meet at the end of next week's meeting on August 20th, which will also be at St. Mark's. So, Jean, happy dollars. What do you have to be happy about?
I have 2 things. Number one, since Austin Seward was mentioned, he was a founding member of First Presbyterian Church, which next month celebrates its 200th anniversary. And secondly, just before I left to come here, I listened to an NPR politics podcast, an interview with Elizabeth Warren, and one of the interviewers was my former student, Asma Kali. I highly recommend it to you.
Martha Wales.
I am glad to report that I seem to be coming out the better end of the year for me. Kneecap, a replacement of the left knee, and recently a replacement of the right knee. So I'm very happy to be here.
Okay.
I'm excited today to welcome my husband's brother and my brother-in-law and sister-in-law to Bloomington after living in California for 45 years. But we expect them today, and I hope to bring them as guests in the future.
I'm giving $1 for each one of the 3 decades that my husband and I celebrated last Friday night together.
Okay, $2 is a fine for not being here last week. And $2 because the grandkids are still here.
And for those who aren't Rotarians, just to know that all of these monies collected go to Teachers Warehouse.
Before I do this, at some point, we need to have the program, Fred, talk about the way Rotary used to be to join, because it's totally different from what we celebrate today. That would be a great program. I had 6 copies. When I moved to Bloomington, I rented 6 storage units, Storage Express. Those of you that don't know, they're $170 each. Yesterday, I'm out of all 6.
Tim.
I'm very happy because my wife and I, this very day, are celebrating our 64th wedding anniversary.
Okay, Jim Harvey.
If we take Phil up on his suggestion to have Fred talk about this, or some of us been in the room long enough to know that there's some things that we don't want to revisit. And one of them is singing.
celebrated 24 years, our 24th anniversary 2 weeks ago.
Okay, and I've got $2 happy for, Martha and I visited my son in Iowa City and one in Chicago over the weekend, and it's just a wonderful thing. Thank you, Jean. And now, Jerry Pagic will introduce our program for today.
Our speaker this morning, or this afternoon, I should say, is Ellen Jacart. Ellen had a career protecting and managing natural areas in Indiana. And I learned today that she and I are both originally from Wisconsin, so that was kind of interesting to find out. Ellen has worked for the Indiana Department of Natural Resources, the U.S. Forest Service, and the Nature Conservancy over the years. She retired a couple of years ago, and she's been devoting her retirement years, but she was actually involved before that with the Indiana Native Plant Society. And she'll be telling us more about her efforts and that group's efforts to deal with the problem of invasive species here in Indiana. Ellen?
Thank you, Jerry, and thank you for inviting me and for providing a lovely lunch and the warm welcome. And just delighted that I wore a white top and I didn't get any spaghetti sauce on it. So, yay. And thank you to Ellen Bergen, who's helping me out as my slide advancer. So I'll be having her moving forward. We're going to talk about invasive species today, and specifically invasive plants. Go ahead. I'm going to talk about some examples of invasive plants, some that you're probably familiar with, but some of the impacts that they're having and why they are a problem. And then I'm going to talk about a couple of the things that we are doing to try and make a difference in this issue, both at the state level and locally. Next. So many of you are probably aware that invasive species are considered to be a huge environmental disaster. There was a study done that found that the economic costs and damages add up to $120 billion per year from invasive species. That total continues to climb as we have more invasive species come into the country and cause a wide variety of impacts, some of which I'm going to talk about. But the other way they really hurt us is the impact on rare species. Those species that are the most threatened in the country, those that are threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act, it turns out that 42% of those species are on the list not because someone destroyed the habitat, but because invasive species came in and degraded the habitat to such a large extent, the species can no longer use it. So they have an incredible impact on the rarest species that we have. Next. So just to put it in context for us, when we're talking about invasive species, you may or may not be aware that Indiana is believed to have 2,865 species in the state growing outside of cultivation. That's from the Biota of North America project, where most of us go for our data on species. How many of the 2,865 are invasive? Well, first you start with the definition, and the definition of invasive has two parts. First, an invasive species is not native, and second, it causes harm. It can be harm to the economy, to the environment, or to human health, but those are the two pieces. Once more. So, out of the 2,865, 685 are not native. The other 2,180 are native. So it's about 25% of the flora of Indiana is considered non-native. But of those, how many are causing harm? How many meet the second part of that definition? Forward. We think it's about 100. There's about 100 species that are truly causing harm that we regularly fight to try and protect the rare species that we have. The rest of them are non-native, but don't cause any problem. They're petunias or corn or a species that's not native to the area, but is not causing any harm. So the point is that it's a really small fraction of the total flora of the state is actually invasive. But the few that there are causing big impacts. Next. So let's talk about Asian bush honeysuckle. How many of you are familiar with Asian bush honeysuckle? Yes, it's right outside the door. It's everywhere in Bloomington and really throughout the state. It's one of the most common invasive species. It's a huge shrub, about 15 feet tall. It has opposite leaves with paired flowers in the axils of the leaves. Forward. And those, hit it again there. And we have those flowers turning into paired berries. You usually see the red berries appearing in the next month or so. Forward one more time. The reason it's a problem is because it grows incredibly densely. It can move in, it's very shade tolerant, and it forms this incredibly dense thicket in the understory of forests, in fields, and so on. That thicket decreases the understory plant diversity, cover, reproduction, and that includes tree seedlings. I mean, if you look at the understory, that's all Asian bush honeysuckle there. There is nothing growing under it because there is no light. There's no water and nutrients available because the Asian bush honeysuckle is taking it all. It also decreases the canopy tree growth. So the big trees that are out there, if they have an Asian bush honeysuckle, this little shrub growing below it, its growth can be reduced up to 50%. And that's because even though those canopy trees look like they are the kings of the world, they can only get so much water and nutrients. And if you have Asian bush honeysuckle putting its roots over yours, it's basically stealing the water and nutrients. And those huge trees stop growing so quickly. Another big issue is the ticks and tick-related illnesses. They found that where you have Asian bush honeysuckle growing densely, you tend to have more ticks and more tick-related illnesses. In areas where they've tested that, they've measured beforehand, they've removed the Asian bush honeysuckle, come back a year later, they found significant reduction in the number of ticks and in the number of illnesses in the surrounding community. And that's because when you have these dense infestations, you tend to have more deer, more mice, the hosts for the ticks that are carrying the diseases. Next. Japanese knotweed is a less well-known invasive plant, but it's around. There are several populations in Monroe County. What it does is it displaces native plants. If you see this picture here in the lower left, that's on the East Coast. In the East Coast and the West Coast, Japanese knotweed grows like this, covers literally hundreds of acres where there is nothing, as far as the eye can see, but Japanese knotweed, 6 to 10 feet tall, huge plant. Here in the Midwest, we tend to have more populations that may be the size of this room. It hasn't been invading as long. So it displaces native plants where it grows. It increases the sediment into streams, that middle picture there. Where we have it, it's almost always on creeks, like Clear Creek, where Cedar Bluffs Nature Preserve is on the south part of the county. Clear Creek runs through it. There used to be Japanese knotweed lining both sides of that creek. And when the spring floods come, when the rains come like they did this year, and you've got the bank overflowing, what happens is there's very little holding the bank in place because Japanese knotweed eliminated all the grasses and everything else that was holding the soil. So the soil rushes down into the creek, providing way more sediment, and nefariously, all of these little root fragments of Japanese knotweed, and each one has a tiny little red bud on it. And wherever that root fragment lands downstream will start a new population. And that's why we see places like Clear Creek having population after population up and down the creek. But the thing that Japanese knotweed is best known for are the last two pictures on the right. It is incredibly damaging to infrastructure. If it is anywhere near a house, it will break through the foundation. It can break through mortar in parking lots. The last picture is Japanese knotweed in a living room. That happens. I saw it for the first time in Bloomington last summer. We do invasive surveys. I'll talk a little bit about that later. And when it gets bad next to a house, it will be in the house with you. And it's incredibly costly to eradicate it. In the United Kingdom, where this species is a huge issue, it came there first. It was brought to the Kew Gardens in the 1700s, and then they exported it to the US in the early 1800s. By then, they knew it was a problem, and they still sent it over here. But in the United Kingdom now, if you are getting a property, if you're buying a property and needing a loan and applying for a mortgage, one of the questions is, does the property have Japanese knotweed? And if it does, you're not getting a mortgage, because it is simply too costly and is too damaging to infrastructure that exists on the site. Next. Okay, the third species is purple winter creeper. How many are familiar with this? Should be. This is one of the most common ground covers in Bloomington, because in the 1950s, this was the go-to landscaping. Everyone had purple winter creeper planted in their yards. It is an evergreen ground cover. So you can see that picture of the forest in the lower right. That is pure winter creeper. That's Murat Park in Indianapolis. Before they started doing control. It looks better today. But then the real problem is that ground cover has the ability to climb trees. This is one of the strange botanical things that happens. There are several vines that change their physiology depending whether they grow this way or this way. When winter creeper grows flat on the ground, the leaves are much smaller, and it cannot flower and it cannot produce fruits. As soon as it goes vertical, the physiology of the plant changes, and it starts heading for the top of the tree to get the sunlight, and then it produces flowers and fruits. And that means birds eat the fruits and spread it all over. So a first step with winter creeper is always keep it down on the ground so that it isn't being spread to other neighboring properties. The problem that it causes is when it gets up top on a tree, it can add easily 1,000 pounds to the top of that tree. Winter creeper can get this big around individual stems, and then it goes out every single branch of the tree and adds weight to it. So when you've got winds, when you've got ice storms adding weight to the canopy, it makes those trees much more vulnerable to wind throw. Next. So Asian bittersweet is another vine that we have. This is the one, if you see the lower left-hand picture, you're familiar with wreaths, that have bittersweet in them. That's this species. And unfortunately, it is also an invasive vine that grows up trees, makes them vulnerable to wind throw, forms very dense canopies. Like you see in the middle, the edge of a forest will just be a green curtain of Asian bittersweet leaves. It also hybridizes with our American bittersweet, which is a native vine that's really decreasing a lot. And one of the reasons we think it's declining is that there is this hybridization going on, so you rarely see American bittersweet these days. Next. Autumn olive. Many people are familiar. How many familiar with autumn olive? Okay, this is really common because it was widely sold even by the state nursery as a wildlife plant. And it has ivory-colored flowers in mid-April, turning into loads of berries in the fall, red berries. And the problem it causes is that it forms really dense thickets. If you're a farmer, you've learned to hate autumn olive because it takes over pastures, it takes over fence rows. It even can move into the understory of forests. And while it doesn't like the shade that much, as soon as a tree falls over, the autumn olive will fill in that gap in the forest and dominate it. So this is one that has become really prevalent in the state because it was so widely planted, particularly along our roadways through the Save Our Small Game program in the 1970s. It was planted up and down I-65, I-69, all of the interstates as a wildlife cover. And from there, it spread to everyone's land. Next. Okay, so I just told you 5 species. Here's the test. 5 species that I just talked about: Asian bush honeysuckle, Japanese knotweed, purple winter creeper, Asian bittersweet, and autumn olive. What do all 5 have in common? And it's not that they're invasive, that's a gimme. But what else do those 5 species have in common? They're invasive, yes. They're not native. They're not all from Asia. One's from Europe. They damage native species, they do. Why did they come here? How did they come here? They brought them here specifically for landscaping. They brought them here to use as plant cover for wildlife, for aesthetics, for soil erosion control. They were deliberately brought here. That's what they have in common. Next. So the reality is that we know most invasive plants come from horticulture. There was a study done by Sarah Reichart back in the 90s, and she looked at all of the woody plants, the shrubs and trees that had escaped cultivation, and where did those plants come from? And it turned out that 85% of them came from horticulture, and 14% came from production forestry or agriculture. So deliberate planting by plant people, horticulturists and botanists and so on. And when you add that together, that's 99%. So we know where the problem is coming from. It's horticulture, and we've known this for a long time. So you would think perhaps that you just say nicely to horticulture, please stop selling invasive plants. We tried that, it didn't work. Next. We started working back in the year 2000, and we invited horticulture to the table, and we formed a group called the Invasive Plant Species Assessment Working Group, where it was people who sold plants, raised plants, it was land trusts, people who were fighting the invasive plants that were moving into our natural areas, researchers, just a wide variety of people to come together to agree on which of these species were invasive and should not be sold. So after a great deal of work, we came up with a list and a brochure that was handed out. Over 100,000 of those were handed out through the years. And that list can now be found at indianainvasivespecies.org, the official list of invasive plants for Indiana. But we did fail to see much of a change in what was being sold and what was being planted by people. The plants in this brochure that we had said, these are bad, you shouldn't plant them, were still widely being sold and planted. So in 2013, when the Indiana Invasive Species Council started working on this project, they asked the state of Indiana, who has jurisdiction, to make just those plants that were highly invasive illegal. Make it illegal to sell them, make it illegal to plant them, and the state agreed to do that. And they drafted a rule, and there were 46 species that were highly invasive. They removed 2 of them because the horticulture, the nursery industry felt that there would be too much of an economic impact to them to stop selling Norway maple and Callery pear. So those were removed. But the rest, the other 44, moved forward in this rule. Next. And this is indeed the rule that was signed by the governor April of this year. It says, if you get rid of the gobbledygook, you can't sell, offer, or grow for sale, gift, barter, exchange, or distribute a species, and that will take effect in April of 2020. There was a 1-year waiting period. And you cannot transport or transfer a species. That'll be effective next year. There was one part, you can't introduce a species, that was effective this year, but it doesn't have any real meaning because introduce a species is defined in this way as, if the species is not already in the state, you may not bring it in. They're all already in the state, so it doesn't matter. So what does matter is the first 2 parts, that as of next April, you're not going to be able to sell them, you're not going to be able to barter them. You can have these species in your yard, they can be there, and you can look at them, but you cannot go and dig that up and transport it. You cannot exchange it or gift it to someone. So if you've got any of the 44 species on your property, you can let them be or you can kill them. Those are your 2 options. You can't get rid of them in any way. Next. So the 44 species, a lot of them, honestly, are things like thistle, plumeless thistle, nodding thistle, or Japanese stilt grass, or garlic mustard, things that are not sold at all. I winnowed down the list to just those that you might be familiar with because they do get sold at least occasionally, and they include trees like amarcork tree, black alder, autumn olive. None of those are widely sold. Shrubs like Japanese barberry, which is a huge seller, glossy buckthorn, bluntleaf privet, all of the Asian bush honeysuckles will be illegal. Of the grasses, there's one, reed canary grass. 3 vines will be illegal, Asian bittersweet, purple winter creeper, Japanese honeysuckle. And then wildflowers like crown vetch, Dame's rocket, and Sericea lespedeza. So these are the better known species that will be illegal as of next April. So one of the questions that we often get is, so what do you do if you see someone selling these as of next April? Next. So fortunately, we have a great system. The Division of Entomology and Plant Pathology is the one that has jurisdiction over this and created this rule. They also have nursery inspector and compliance officers located around the state. And they are the ones that take reports and are required to inspect every plant seller. They inspect them anyway. But now there are these 44 species that are also illegal to sell that they'll be watching for. And we have Ken Coate is our nursery inspector right here in Bloomington. And so the bottom line is if you go to Lowe's next April and you see that they are selling Japanese barberry, you send Ken an email. And I've been doing this for years because there are a number of species that are already illegal, like purple loosestrife or yellow iris. And within 24 hours, there will be an inspector there educating the business owner, removing the illegal stock, and giving them a warning. And if it's repeated, then there is a fine that they will be levied. So that's what's going to be happening next April. We're hoping to have a field guide created by then so that people can have a little book that tells them what these look like and how to identify these species and so on. So that's the statewide way we're dealing with this. In addition to education, now having this rule, trying to decrease the number of invasive species that are being sold. Next. I did want to mention before I stop talking, and hopefully have a few minutes for questions, that we also have a local group called MC-IRIS, the Monroe County Identify and Reduce Invasive Species group. And we have a website, mc-iris.org, and we have a lot of information there on invasive species, how to control those invasive species, and so on. Next. Some of the things that we do are, first, we do invasive plant surveys. We've done over 100 now. But if you're a county resident, there's a little form on our website where you can ask for a survey for free. We come out, we have about 10 volunteers who take turns going out and telling you which of the species in your yard are invasive or native, and giving you advice on how to control what you've got. Because we find many people just don't know what they're looking at and need help identifying, is that Japanese stilt grass or what do I have? Every year we have a huge education day. That's our Sustaining Nature and Your Land Day, Snail Day. And we have been doing that for the last several years at City Hall as part of Farmers Market. We take the plaza over and we have the weed lab, and everyone is encouraged to bring us your weeds. And people come with bags of weeds, and we have the foremost experts on weeds in the county. They're lined up with live specimens of all of the invasives so that you can get one-on-one consultation with how do I get rid of this stuff that's in my yard. We also do more advanced training, take control workshops once or twice a year. The next one is coming up at Karst Farm Park on September 21st. And we do that in conjunction with Ivy Tech Lifelong Learning. And so in 3.5 hours, you can learn all of the skills you need to identify and control invasive plants on your land. And also, I put some of the weed wrangle flyers on tables. The other thing we do to get people out in in our city parks and help city parks with control of invasive plants is we choose a park every first Saturday and meet out there and work with the city to control invasive plants. And so it's a good way to see a city park that you haven't seen before. September 7th, we're going to be at RCA Park, kind of on the south side, nice little park. And you can also, again, learn how to identify the invasive plants and get rid of them. Next. And here are some of the websites that I mentioned, just if you wanted to jot any of those down. Anything about invasive species, indianainvasivespecies.org. Anything about native plants, indiananativeplants.org. And mciris-iris.org. So I would be happy to answer any questions you've got. Thank you. Anne? Yes.
We got neighbors together.
Yes.
And we looked at my yard, and there were, I didn't know anything happened, but I wrote some more, anyone else, any subject matter. But I didn't know all my pretty plants, a lot of them were invasive. So I recommend any kind of children that live in other communities, bring some plants, guys, bring some neighbors. And then I handed out a flyer with a picture of a tree that is covered with winter creep, and I said, I didn't say it like that, because it was all in my neighborhood. But I said, remove these because it's reducing the value of your home, and that's what children focus on. Within 2 weeks, they've taken it down off their tree, they recognize their tree, and it does make a difference in the value of your home. People looking to buy a home, if it's overwhelmed, instead, you're not going to buy your house.
Yeah, and having a tree covered with winter creeper is also more likely to fall on your house. But yeah, that's a good point. Jillian Fields is working with us, and she is like sort of taken us up a notch and beyond just individual landowners. Now we do neighborhood surveys, so we get the whole neighborhood together and work together on invasive issues.
One more, and then Ellen, will you be able to stay a couple of minutes?
Sure,
afterwards?
absolutely. Be happy to.
This may be a foolish question, but since these plants were brought here, how were they not being invasive when they were? Why would they be brought if they already knew they were problem children?
Good question. If you didn't hear it, the question is, if they're invasive here, why aren't they invasive back home? Or if they are, why did they send them over here? The main reason it's avoidance, it's the avoidance theory that they brought these things over as plants, but they didn't bring the fungi that live on them. They didn't bring the animals that eat them, the insects that eat them, and they had a free playing field here in North America. There's nothing going to bother them. Nothing eats them, which is another reason we're concerned about them, is that if you've got these plants, they are worthless to wildlife. You need to, it's our native plants that are utilized by pollinators and so on, and so yeah, they survive here and thrive so much because there are no bugs bothering them, no fungi, no nothing.
Thank you. Unintended consequences, huh? Thank you, Ellen. In honor of your presentation, we're going to give a donation to the Monroe County Community School Lunch Fund. Final announcements. Next week, we meet on Tuesday, August 20th, noon, again, St. Mark's. Remember to be careful of the traffic patterns here. There are a lot of preschool kids. Our speaker next week will be Wansuk Kim, speaking about art and philanthropy. Our greeter next week will be Judy Witt, Pledge of Reflection by Mike Baker, introduction of guests by Michael Shermis, and the roundabout reporter, again, Katie Beck. Thought of the week. A people that values its privilege above principles soon lose both. From President Dwight David Eisenhower. So if you'll please rise and help me recite the four-way test. For those who don't know it, there's a yellow card on your table. There was. Of the things we think or do, first, is it the truth? Second, is it fair to all concerned? Third, will it build goodwill and better friendships? Fourth, be beneficial to all concerned? And fifth, is it fun?